Good evening, everyone, and welcome. A happy Hanukkah to all. Welcome to tonight's lecture about the Jews of Spain and Portugal. Notice I didn't say Spanish Portuguese Jews because that's a separate history almost because of that came after the expulsion. This is really mainly the history of Jews when they were living in Spain and Portugal. Before I begin, I just wanted to thank my fellow Canadian, Professor Henry Abramson, who does phenomenal work in terms of giving Jewish history lectures, and really I use a lot of his material in preparing this, so I'm very thankful to him for this. When did Jews start living in Spain and Portugal? When did it all begin? How far back do you think it went? So it's interesting. There's traditions among Spanish Jews of them going back all the way to the time of even King Solomon and the first temple. But we're gonna see exactly when it all started. But before we go to when it all started, it's important to understand how Spanish Jewry changed each and every one of you. Every single person listening, watching has been transformed by Spanish Jewry. If you ever sing in synagogue, has anyone here ever sung in synagogue? That is something that comes from Spanish Jews. Have you ever read a Jewish Shabbat song, a song like Derori Kra, the Shabbat songs that we sing? That comes from Spanish Jews. The Kabbalah, as we know it today, very much also comes from Spanish Jews. The concept of Jewish philosophy, Machshevet Yisrael, books like the Kuzari, all this comes from the unique way that Spanish Jewry existed. And so it's important to understand that maybe second to Babylonian Jewry, Spanish Jewry shaped the way all of us are Jewish. Again, whether it has to do with our understanding of Torah and science, living a life that integrates a Jewish life and also a well-integrated, educated life. Whether it's poetry, the revival of Hebrew language, the passion to go back and live in Israel, all these things were really supercharged by Spanish Jews. And so to learn about Spanish Jewry is really also to learn about ourselves, whether we are descendants of the Spanish Jews or not, because Spanish Jewry shaped Judaism in a way that no other community has ever before. And so let's go back and see how it all started. It's interesting. There's a verse in the book of Ovadia from the Bible that reads as follows: V'galut hachel asher livnei Israel asher Knaanim, the exile that applies to the people of Israel from the land of Canaan, ad Tzarfat. Now, what is Tzarfat in modern Hebrew? It's France. And Galut, here's the pasuk that Spanish Jews really took great pride in. The Galut Yerushalayim asher bisfarad, the exile of Jerusalem that is in Sfarad. Let me read it in English. And this exiled host of the children of Israel who are with the Canaanites as far as Tzarfat, and the exile of Jerusalem, which is in Sfarad, shall inherit the cities of the southern land. So there's a prophecy of the exile of Jerusalem, which is in Sfarad and Tzarfat, being returned to the land of Israel. So that's an astonishing mentioning of the exile pretty early on. Rashi in his commentary says that Tzarfat here refers to France, which is pretty local because Rashi himself lived in, Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki lived in France. And so Rabbi Avram Ibn Ezra later says, no, it can't be referring to the fact that Jews were living in Spain in the time of the first temple, because Jews weren't necessarily living in Spain in the time of the first temple, but he says it's a prophecy. It's a prophecy that in the days of the second temple, Jews will be expelled to Spain and they will be returned to the land of Israel. Interestingly, this prophecy is historic, meaning it does concur with the fact, and that is that Jews ended up being settled in Spain on their own or by force at the time of the Second Temple, even perhaps before the expulsion of the Jews in the year 70 CE. And so the Jewish community in Spain goes a very, very long way back. Remember, Spain eventually in the 200s was part of the Roman Empire. So as long as you were part of the Roman Empire, you pretty much could be coming from Israel all the way to Spain. And so Jews in Spain is a very, very early thing. But most commentaries agree that that's the time we're talking about, the time of the end of the Second Temple. This is when Jews start moving to Spain. Interestingly, if you take a look in the Talmud, there's the mentioning of a place called Aspamia. And even though scholars do not agree about Sfarad in the Bible being Spain, Aspamia mentioned in the Talmud is actually, according to most scholars, is Spain. And so there's extensive mentioning of Spain. And it says that, if I'll just give a few examples of when the Talmud mentions Spain. It says if a person goes missing, if chas v'chalila, you have a situation of an aguna, where the husband goes missing and you want to know if the wife needs a divorce or she can be considered to be a widow, etc. So it says that if a person goes missing, then it's possible that they went all the way to Spain and therefore they are they're not back. It's like, it's the husband's excuse. Where were you? Why did you come so late? I went to Spain. So that the Talmud takes into account the possibility that people lived in Spain. Interestingly, in 1480, people in Spain found a stone, which you can take it for what it is, which says this is the tombstone of Adoniram. Adoniram is the tax collector of King Solomon. So there's no question that Spanish Jews believed that their community goes back all the way to the time of the First Temple. There's interestingly another tombstone of a child, tragically, that is from the 3rd century, and that actually had Hebrew on it. So again, there's no question that Jews have been in Spain since the definitely the time of the Second Temple. The Talmud also says that all the ships all the blessings in the world come to the world through the Jewish people, and even ships that sail from Galia to Aspamia are blessed because of the Jewish people. What does Galia sound like to everyone? Galilee could be one thing, but in this case, it's talking about something close to Spain. What could Galia be? The Gaul, which is, I believe, Britain, right? Anyhow, so there is this mentioning of a Spain, which seems to be in the proximity of Europe. And another example that it gives is if someone buys a field in the land of Israel and you want to establish your ownership on it, you have to wait 3 years. Why? 1 year for the person to live in it, 1 year for someone to go tell the owner if the owner lives in Spain, and 1 year for that person to come back. Either way, in the year 218, Rome conquers Spain. And interestingly, even a bit before that, Paul in the Christian New Testament writes that he's going to Spain to convert people to Christianity. Now, he typically would only go to convert Jews. I guess he was bored with other people. He only wanted to convert Jews. And so he writes, I'm going to Spain. So you can tell that there's already Jews living in Spain very, very early on. And that's what happens. In the year 306, that's when you have the first official mentioning of Jews in Spain, not in a good context. This is when Spain becomes more and more Christian, and the bishop and the city council of Granada start making anti-Jewish laws, literally anti-Jewish laws. Something that's important to note about Spain. The highest points in Jewish history in exile were in Spain. Jews came very high to power. They were very successful. But it's also important to note the worst decrees against the Jewish people started off in Spain. Laws forbidding Jews, ghettos started in Spain. Laws forbidding Jews from holding any official office started in Spain. Laws forbidding marriage between a non-Jew and a Jew, Spain. Laws that say that even Jews who converted to Christianity are not the same as just people who were born Christian, which is basically the Nazi racial idea. All that also started in Spain. So it's important to note that as much as Spain had its blessings, it's also the cradle of the most systemic anti-Semitism. Of course, there were barbaric acts of anti-Semitism all over Europe, but Spain was where it started in a very targeted way, barring Jews from public office, etc., things like that. So there's a lot of good to mention, but there's also some really, really cruel things that started there. And that's in the year 306, where you have the bishop and the city council of Granada deciding that Jews cannot marry non-Jews, and several other laws pertaining to separating the Jews from the general population. In the meantime, what you also find is archaeology. you can start finding synagogues and houses of worship. You can start finding Jewish graves. Very, very early on in the 3rd to 5th century, you can find a tombstone that's in Hebrew, Latin, and Greek. So you know, there's hard evidence that the Jews have been there for a very long time. In the 500s, there's a new kingdom that comes into Spain called the Visigoths, who are very, very brutal. They're very they eventually convert to Catholicism, and they put in very, very brutal laws into place in terms of persecuting the Jews. And we speak about, you know, for example, crypto Jews, not the kind of crypto Jews that you're seeing now in the news with cryptocurrency, a different kind. But you see the concept of Jews who converted to Christianity and lived secretly as Jews, expulsions of Jews. All these things were happening in Spain centuries and centuries before 1492. It's just that 1492 is when it was like a final thing. But there were expulsions and bans on being Jewish inside Spain long before, almost actually not 1,000 years, but about 800 years before the famous Ferdinand and Isabella, so infamous. So that's just important to note. And so the Visigoths come in and they put in really brutal laws against the Jews. Now, interestingly, what happens next? A lot of Jews, once they put in a law in the year 613, which is, by the way, ironic because, you know, 613 we like to think of as a Jewish number, but there's a lot of Jews who, there's a Visigothic king who puts in a law that says basically you can't be openly Jewish in Spain. So what do Jews do? What's the closest country to Spain? Portugal, France, but that's by land. But if you're in southern Spain, which is where most Jews came, I guess people came by ship, then Morocco, people crossed in. So what many Jews did, it ended up backfiring on that king. Many Jews went to Morocco and they regrouped with whom? With the Muslims. The Muslims were about to conquer Spain. And so the Jews who were from Spain went to Morocco once they were banned, and they started preparing together with the Muslims for the conquest of Iberia, which ended up being very successful. So it's just a sort of lesson in history how someone sometimes can be against the Jews, and then the Jews come back at them and conquer them, which is what happened when they came to when the Jews came to Morocco, and they regrouped there. In the meantime, it doesn't mean there were no Jews living in Spain at all, because there were Jews who were Converso Jews. So just think about that. We're in the 600s, the 7th century, and there are already crypto Jews. And this happens throughout the time in Spain. So if someone ever tells you it happens every now and then, politicians and all kinds of random people say, I actually think I'm a descendant of a crypto Jew, it's probably true, because there have been Jews forcibly converted to Christianity in Spain for now almost 1,500 years. So there's no news. As King Solomon said, En chadash tachat hashemesh, there's nothing really that is new. All right, I see we have here people from the audience answering that Gaul is modern France. So which makes a lot of sense because the Talmud puts Gaul and Spain together. All right, now, very interesting thing. Once the Jews come in, they go together with the Muslims, and the year 711, the Jews and the Muslims conquer Spain. Now, what's unique about Spain and Spanish Jewry? Usually, in the olden days, you can divide the world into sort of the ancient world that we speak about often into two parts. One is you have the Muslim area and you have the Christian area. Spain is an area that has both. There are many, because it's the entry point from Morocco to Europe, there are many, many Muslims there, and Spain switches off from being Christian to Muslim, Muslim to Christian. So Jews that are living there are really the only Jewish community that have a taste of both. They're able to understand that there are many different perspectives. They're able to contend with both Christianity and Islam. And so that leads to some kind of sophistication. That leads to them being able to see all three religions. And that leads to also a lot of important works that are later in our heritage. But in the year 711, the Muslims take over. And the Muslims are the best friends of the Jews, because remember, who's been persecuting Jews by this year, which is pretty early on, 711, who's been persecuting Jews already for hundreds of years? Christians. And so the Muslims, they have certain laws about what Jews can't do. They have dhimmi laws. Jews can't build bigger synagogues than mosques, but they got along very, very, very well. And especially in such a hostile situation, the Muslims knew that the only ones they can really trust in Spain are the Jews, because the Jews are the ones who will suffer most under Christians. Obviously, that would backfire later, because once the Christians take over and they realize that the Jews are the ones who are with the Muslims, that can backfire. But in general, the Jews are doing very well with the Muslims. A bit later on, there's a radical Muslim faction called the Almohads, who are coming from Morocco, and that they famously expel Maimonides and several other Jews because they are also extremists and they believe also convert or die. And so that's where you have also a lot of Jews fleeing Spain, most famously Maimonides and his family. But in general, life in Spain under Muslims is really, really, really good. Now, before I continue with the actual history of the, which king conquered which person, I want to talk to you about the character of Spanish Jewry, the people there, and what they have done for us. Really phenomenal, phenomenal things. So first of all, number one, I would say, gift that we got from Spanish Jewry is the ability to coexist, the ability to live with others. It's not just that Spanish Jews were able to live with Muslims and Christians. Spanish Jews were able to live with their brothers and sisters who converted to Christianity. Spanish Jews had, once you converted to Christianity, even if it was a forced conversion, you were not allowed to go back. So you had situations where the same family had, one brother was a Christian, one brother was a Jew, and everyone got along with the other. This is much less the reality in Ashkenazic Jewish communities. They really, the Spanish Jews got along with one another. They got along with one another because there's writings about these things that they lived in peace side by side. Does it mean that they all went to each other for Rosh Hashanah dinner? I don't know. But you had part of what got it's a good question and brings out a very good point. Part of what got the Christian rulers angry is when they saw that the forcibly converted Christians were still such pals with their old friends, with the Jews. So they were forced to convert to Christianity, but they were hanging out on Shabbat.
But it doesn't make sense that some were forced to convert and others weren't.
How did that happen? So the forced conversions already happened at the time of the Visigoths in the 600s. And it's unfortunately intermittent throughout Spanish Jewish history. Some are forced to convert. How does it end up being that some are, some aren't? It could be that Spain was not a united kingdom. There were a bunch of, you have Castilla, Aragon. There's all kinds of different kingdoms. It could have to do with that. It could be with what you were willing to lose, or the mob. Sometimes it was a mob driven. Similar to the Crusades, there would be a mob coming into your town, convert or die. So they came to your town, they didn't come to my town. There are different ways that it could have impacted only some. But it's a good question. Why would some be converted and others not? Probably because it wasn't a unified country, and it was also very much mob-driven or locally driven. But they got along with one another. I'll just give you a different example. In the 1600s, there was a very infamous cult of Jews in Poland. It was called the cult of Jacob Frank. I don't want to get into what they did. They were very deviant. But the Jewish community, now you had to belong in Europe to any kind of religion. A lot of countries, it's still like that. You have to sort of belong to, I spoke about that with Einstein. You had to belong to some kind of organized religion in Europe, even in the 1900s. And so the Jews excommunicated the followers of Jacob Frank, which meant they had to be out in the cold. They couldn't live in the ghetto. And unless they accepted Christianity, they could not be part of the Jewish community, and they couldn't be part of any other community. So 4,000 of them converted to Christianity. on the condition, they were accepted on the condition that they're going to say bad things about the Talmud and the Jews, and they ended up doing it. But they blamed those who excommunicated them. Something like that would never happen with Spanish Jews. Meaning, never would the Spanish Jewish community say, we are now going to throw you to freeze in the winter because you guys are not even Christian. You guys are just doing things in a way that doesn't, it's against the Torah. Things like that did not happen with Spanish Jewry. We're going to see, there's the famous tale about Kol Nidre, how it's about reuniting those who converted and those who didn't convert. We'll get to that. But Sephardic Jews did not turn on one another. And by the way, you see that to this day. It's very important to understand Sephardic Jews in general today. You'll see Sephardic Jews, you'll see one with a black yarmulke, and his brother has no yarmulke, and they come for a Shabbat meal. You go to like Borough Park or to New Square, that's not going to happen. Once you left the Hasidic community, rarely will you be welcomed into the community in your I guess, new form. So I think that's something that resonates to this day. You look at Mizrahi Jews, Sephardic Jews, it's there's a lot more friendship, there's a lot more eating at each other. You're traditional, you're Haredi, it doesn't matter. You're sort of all one family, and it's hard to know which one was the right one. Meaning, on the one hand, each side has its long-term benefits. Ashkenazim excommunicated the way the Amish do, where once you're out, you don't come back for meals or anything. Sephardim didn't do that. And it's hard to tell. You have the famous debate between Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch in the 1800s in Germany, where he believes that you have to separate the communities. I do have the German word for it, for those who want. Großgemeinde versus Ostrich, where basically in some communities they believed in all Reform, Conservative, and Orthodox being registered under the same denomination, and Rabbi Hirsch believed that you have to separate. So Sephardic Jews didn't have that kind of attitude. They got along partially because of the reality that every few decades or 100 years, half of them or some of them were being forcibly converted, and they stayed friends. So it's just I think it definitely has something to teach us about to get along with people who are different than us. Again, it could be that the strict Ashkenazi approach was right long term. I don't know. I didn't. It's a hard thing to study. I know in Hungary it was a big debate. I don't know if anyone here is from Hungary and familiar with that debate. Once the reform came in, do you separate? Do you not separate? I don't know. But in terms of Spanish Jewry, they always stuck together. They're always with your family. No matter what happens, you're still friends. And it got the Christians very mad, because if you converted to Christianity, why are you going to the Bronx Zoo with your Jewish cousins? So it got them angry, and it got them to believe that the Converso Jews, shockingly, were not as devoted to Christianity as they would like them to be. It's just, it's an important lesson in terms of getting along. You see that it resonates even politically in Israel. So giving it just an example, are you familiar with the Israeli political map, sort of? Yeah. So you have two ultra-Orthodox party. There's the Aguda party, the Ashkenazi one, and then there's Shas, the Sephardic party. Shas gets many, many votes from people who are not completely, but they don't observe Shabbat the same way as others. The Haredi Ashkenazi party is strictly pretty much whoever's part of their group. So, the fact that the Sephardic Haredi party gets votes from people who are not Orthodox tells you that they have that ability to sort of all come together. This can get into a bigger subject, but yeah, that's something I think we got from Sephardic Jews. Another very important thing we got from Jews of Spain: poetry. There was no major Jewish poetry. There was Rabbi Elazar HaKalir, who wrote before that a few lamentations, but by and large, the innovation of Jewish poetry came through Spanish Jewry. Now, it came with two benefits. One is they separated, unlike Ashkenazi Jews, they separated Aramaic from Hebrew proper. And that's a huge deal. I don't know if anyone ever heard someone speak in a way that mixes Aramaic, Hebrew, they call it Yeshivish or Yinglish. But Sephardic Jews, they separated out the actual proper Hebrew, and they started writing beautiful poetry. If you open your Shabbat prayer books, these Mirot, you will see there are countless songs that are written by almost exclusively Sephardic Jews. Why? Because they had a beautiful sense for poetry. Poetry was thriving in the Muslim world there. It was a science unlike today, where in those days they counted syllables and the rhymes. It was a very intense science, and Jews engaged in that. In fact, they also did it in a secular way. Poetry for weddings was a business. You come to a wedding, if it's today, you go to a good wedding, what is it? They have a good smorgasbord and ice cream and whatever. In those days, no, you can afford to bring a talented poet to write you a poem about the Chatan and Kala. And so some of our greatest rabbis, like the Ibn Ezra, that's what they would do. They would write poems for a living until they eventually made it big. It's interesting, the Ibn Ezra, who we're learning about, also a Spanish rabbi, he was very poor. And he said once about how bad his mazel was. He said, if I were to become an undertaker and bury people in the cemetery, people would stop dying, because every business that he touched didn't succeed. So he said, if I became an undertaker, no one would be dying anymore. And he was also one of these poets who would travel from city to city, and he would get gigs. It was a gig economy. You just wrote poems for weddings, for funerals, other occasions, and it also taught them to be amazing commentators. So that's why they're such linguists. We're going to see in a second. You open a Chumash, even Rashi, his commentary is hugely inspired by Donash and other great Sephardic Jews. So the whole idea of Hebrew as a language that has a science to it and grammar, all this is really very much the product of Spanish Jews, and that's a phenomenal thing. There's a famous piece that Bialik, Chaim Nachman Bialik, who was a modern Hebrew poet, said that after the scripture and the Talmud and the Midrash, there's no greater creation like Sephardic poetry. There's nothing like it, because there were great men of spirit, and it really inspired people. Another thing that we can thank Sephardic Jews for, again, singing in synagogues, not only as just a musical thing where you have the cantor singing, but the idea, I don't know, different people have different enjoyments, but has anyone ever enjoyed singing with the whole synagogue, not just hearing one person? That was very much a Spanish Jewish thing. The Spanish Jews taught us essentially how to pray as a congregation. I remember walking in Jerusalem. People, by the way, go on tours for this. I remember walking in Jerusalem around the Slichot time in the month of Elul, and you hear the whole Sephardic community. They wake up at 4 a.m., whatever it may be, and they sing together, and everyone is singing every word, and they're reading these poems. It's really very beautiful, and that again comes from the Jews of Spain. Another thing that we got from the Jews of Spain, lay leadership. Now, I'm not talking just about someone who is very wealthy and writes a check. I'm talking about someone who is we always had Jews who were donors. We always had Jews who advocated for the community on to the government. But what they had were people, lay leaders, who were great men of spirit, who knew the community from the inside, who were builders of schools on their own, they brought in scholarship. They themselves were great scholars. They knew the community inside out. They weren't just writing a check. They knew what they wanted to do. They were doctors. They were ministers. They were really people who knew the community. They knew the government, and they took the lead in terms of building the community. The greatest of these all was Rabbi Chasdai ibn Shaprut. He lived in the year 915 to 975, and he spoke Hebrew, Arabic, Latin, and Romance, aka Spanish, which tells you about Spanish Jews. education was fundamental. You read about any Spanish great Sephardic rabbi, they studied philosophy, poetry, medicine. They studied a lot, and they valued general education. It wasn't even a question to them that this was an important aspect of Jewish life. And so Chazdai ibn Shaprut then becomes a doctor, and he becomes a doctor for the leader, Abd el-Rahman, who was a Muslim leader, and he becomes his personal doctor. Only in those days, you can get a promotion from being the king's doctor to becoming the minister of defense, which is what he was. He went on to become a minister, even a vizier, and he became one of the greatest advocates of the larger Jewish community. If Jews in Byzantine were being prosecuted or persecuted, he would summon the ambassador. He took interest in the Jews of Khuzar, which is the Khazar Jews who converted to Judaism in the area around Ukraine, north of Turkey, and he took a great interest of that. When Jews in France were persecuted, he contacted the French government. When Jews in Germany were persecuted, he contacted that government. It just gives you an idea, A, of how prominent he was, that he was able to summon all those governments, and also how much he cared. He cared about the Jews of many different communities, and he also would take great interest in the Jews of the Khuzarim. His greatest act, I don't want to say greatest because there were many things, he made Spain second to Babylon. Until then, the spiritual center of Judaism is in Babylon. That's where the Talmud is written. That's where the Geonim are. And he decides he will turn Spain into the next Babylon. How do you turn Spain into the next Babylon? First of all, I hate to say this, he starts sending donations to the yeshivot of Babylon. Then letters, any question they have in Talmud, Jewish law, they send to the rabbis in Babylon. When the letters come back, they read them to everyone in the town square. And he does something that didn't exist in many communities, a full copy of the Talmud. Of all volumes of the Talmud, he brings to Spain. Believe it or not, many, if not most Jewish communities did not have a full copy of the Talmud. The Talmud today, I think, has 2,700 folio pages. And so to have a full copy of the Talmud was a big deal. And he does that. Another thing that he does, he redeems a slave. What do I mean? One of the great rabbis of Babylon was taken by pirates. The famous tale about 3 rabbis from Babylon. It almost sounds like a beginning of a joke or something. But 3 great rabbis from Babylon traveled to raise money. They were taken by pirates. And one of them was this really, really great scholar. And Ibn Shaprut redeems him on a condition. You start opening a yeshiva here in Spain. Can you imagine that condition? You're held hostage by pirates, and they tell you, we'll let you, but unless you have to start a new life here in Spain. And that's what he does. Ibn Shaprut redeems him, and his name is Rabbi Moshe ben Chanoch, and he starts him off there. And it's really, that's what happens. Spain becomes the next Babylon. It becomes the next epicenter of Talmudic scholarship, of Torah leadership. It is the next crown of the Jewish world. And that's what he does. He also brings scholars. 2 notably famous scholars, Donash ben Levart and Menachem ben Saruk, who Rashi quotes often. They're great linguists. He brings them to Spain. I don't know if anyone here is a big Hebrew grammar geek, but for those who are, there's something called a shvana and shvanach and chataf patach and chataf kamatz. These are all established by these linguists who he's bringing to Spain. So Spain becomes the center of Talmud. It becomes the center of poetry. It becomes the center of Jewish thought and philosophy. And so it's now at the head of the Jewish community. And he even takes interest, again, in terms of sort of being the World Jewish Congress. Whenever there's trouble, he'll contact that town and place, and he'll make sure that the Jews there are out of trouble. Now, after his death, he's succeeded by a person called Rabbi Shmuel Nagid. Has anyone ever been in Sharei Chesed in Israel, neighborhood near Rehavia? Anyhow, so there they have all these streets, one near the other. There's Ramban Street, Shmuel Nagid Street, Rambam Street. It's interesting. Rambam and Ramban sound very similar. Moshe ben Nachman and Moshe ben Maimon, both great Sephardic scholars. So to differentiate, they changed the name of the street in Israel from Rambam Street to Ben Maimon. Why? Because they didn't want people to confuse it with Ramban Street. So one is Ramban and one is Ben Maimon. And so he has all these great scholars that he brings, and Shmuel Nagid actually leads Muslim armies to war. Can you imagine that? A Jew who is working as a court Jew is leading the Muslim world to the Muslim army to war. Now we have, unfortunately for the Jews there, the Christian takeover. The Christians take over again. They take over Spain, and this leads to some problems. Why? Problems for them and problems for us. First of all, they're much less tolerant to Jews, and also it's not like other parts of Europe. Why? Other parts of Europe, the Catholic Church made people very ignorant, and they made people illiterate. They made sure people didn't know how to read. That was a policy of theirs, and so it wasn't hard to govern. If you're Catholic, to govern Greece and Poland and places like this, you just made sure no one knew how to read, and they just listened to your priest. The priest was the only one who knew how to read. But in Spain, you had people who for hundreds of years have been accultured and sophisticated and literate and philosophers, etc. So what do? So they start having public disputations. Has anyone ever heard of the public disputation of Barcelona? They start having, there's actually a great, the BBC did a great rendition of it. It's about an hour, you can find it online. They decided they're going to start doing disputations. Some are more famous than others. Basically, it's like, imagine a presidential debate, except the candidates are the two religions. They don't want to debate Islam, they want to debate Judaism. I don't know, by the way, why they didn't want to debate Islam. I guess that wasn't as popular. And the Christians start saying, okay, we want a public debate. Now, if you are who you are, if you're someone like me, for example, and you find yourself on the court of the NBA, and one of the players who is 7-8 feet tall comes to you and says, do you want to play a game? What's the proper response, you think? Probably not a great, it's not going to be a great game. So if you're a Jewish minority who's been, if you go to, if Chas v'Chalila, this should never happen to anyone, if you're, heaven forbid, captured by ISIS, and they say, let's debate religion, that's not a good situation because you don't have a good way out of that. And so the Jews are invited to this disputation, and it's hard because you can argue, but if you win, you're kind of toast. Yes. So famously, one of the kings, the James I of Aragon, invites Nachmanides, Rabbi Moshe ben Nachman, in 1263, and he says, let's have a disputation, but unlike the other debates, I will be fair. Why did this debate become so famous? A, because the actors are very famous. Rabbi Moshe ben Nachman, Nachmanides is like one of the greatest. And also because both sides recorded their account of the debate, and the accounts are mostly similar, interestingly. Obviously not identical, but they both write how they think it went. And the king assures him, don't worry, it's okay, you can say whatever you want. Spoiler alert, let's just say he finds himself in another country soon after. Not soon after, but he does. Yeah, they have this debate, and it's public, and the person he debates is named Pablo Christiani, and this man is a convert who converted to Christianity from Judaism, and he has this whole debate. Nachmanides does well for himself, and the king comes to him eventually with a parcel of money, and he says, go on the witness protection program. Why don't you find yourself another country to live in, because you did well, but maybe you should go for your safety, find yourself a different country. This is not a small deal, because he goes to Israel, and he's one of the Spanish Jews who end up helping rebuild Israel. We're going to see later, after the expulsion of Jews in Spain in 1492, a lot of them go to Tzfat. The Jews of Spain are phenomenal. In one of the ways is that they are constantly wanting to go to Israel. They really yearn for Israel, and so they Nachmanides goes to Israel once he won the debate. So I guess that's a kind of a victory in the sense that he did well on the debate and he goes there. Interestingly, another side of our, I'm not going to get into this because it deserves a lecture in and of itself. I don't know if anyone here is interested in Kabbalah, in mysticism, but the Big Bang of Kabbalah is in Spain. It starts originally, a lot of it starts up in Provence, in France, southern France, which is very close to Spain, but it really goes and as they say today, goes viral in Spain. There's a whole debate exactly who wrote what part of the Zohar, but there's a rabbi named Rabbi Moshe de Leon, and he is the sort of codifier, the guy who puts out the Zohar. Depends who. There's a huge debate on this. I'm not going to even get into it, especially since I'm badly positioned. I'm a Litvak, a Lithuanian Jew, who are very boring and don't like the flair and excitement that comes with Kabbalah. So I'm going to stay out of the debate. But basically, the founding fathers, in many ways, of Kabbalah are from Spain. Rabbi Moshe de Leon in the Zohar, Rabbi Moshe Cordoviero from Cordova. He is also a Spanish Jew, and most famously, the Arizal, Rabbi Isaac Luria from Tzfat, is the son of a Spanish Jewish woman. And so Kabbalah and mysticism is very much the product of what Spanish Jew is all about. Songs like Lecha Dodi, all these things that shape, or the Nusach Ari. You go to every synagogue, they have at least one Sidur that's the style of the Arizal. Lurianic Kabbalah, it infuses Hasidut. It does a lot to shape who we are as a people, and that very much is the part of from Spanish Jewry. Long story short, unfortunately, all this glory starts coming to an end. 1391, you have great riots in Spain against Jews, violent riots. And in 1492, as you know, it can be a coincidence, by the way, 1492, you have the Spanish expulsion. And interestingly, the head of and this goes with the theme of what I mentioned all along, the head of the Inquisition gives a justification for kicking the Jews out. What's his justification? They are a bad influence on the Jews who already converted to Christianity. So because they already had so many Converso Jews, he says, look, if we let these Jews stay around, they will just cause the Jews that are already Christians feel bad about their Christianity, and in that sense, they're a threat. So that's where you have that. There's a whole article on CNN and other publications. How Jewish was Christopher Columbus? Was he Jewish? But there's no question that on that ship there were Converso Jews. And in the next 200 years after 1492, Spanish Jews continue to flee. And there's the famous story called Nidre, is about them basically undoing vows. It's an urban legend a bit, but they're undoing vows where they vowed to be Christian. Just the numbers are greatly debated. At the time, Jews are given an option. By the way, this option was given in Spain, not in Portugal. The Jews are given an option in Spain to leave or stay. If you leave, you can take your like clothing and stuff, but you can't take any gold, silver. Basically, you gotta, the way Jews had to leave Arab lands in 1948, you had to leave without nothing. 40 to 100,000 left. There's really huge debates about the numbers. Different scholars give different estimates, but 200,000 Jews remained. Famously, the treasurer, Don Isaac, people call him different names. His name is Abravanel, but some people call him Abravanel or Abravanel. Either way, he even though he's allowed to stay, he leaves in solidarity with the Jewish people. Imagine, he's the minister of finance of the treasurer of Spain, and he decides to leave. And he says a very interesting thing to the king. He gives a very passionate speech, and he says, "This is the last you will hear of the glory of Spain." He says, "You guys have been the epicenter of culture, poetry, literature, philosophy, what have you not." He says, when you guys are expelling the Jews, that is pretty much the end of Spain as a center for anything. And in many ways, he was right. Maybe soccer, not as much, but pretty much that is true. And it's interesting. I was in Barcelona a few years ago. We had a stopover. Has anyone ever heard of the Sephardic name Toledano? So the name Toledano, many say, comes from the word Toleda, no, meaning Spanish Jews took a vow that they will never ever go back to Spain, and supposedly they made a cherem, an excommunication. No Jew should ever be allowed to go back to Spain, similar to Jews saying we won't ever go back to Germany. But we had a stopover on the way to Israel. I stopped over in Spain. I go to Barcelona. First of all, there's a mountain called Montjuic, the mountain of Jews, and there's an old Jewish cemetery there. Then you go to the Jewish quarter. You can almost feel the Hebrew songs being sung in the air. There's a whole beautiful sign about the glorious community, Jewish community of Barcelona. One little detail they forget to mention is that they were forcibly expelled. You would almost think that they went on a vacation to Hawaii. But you can see exactly where people lived. And Spanish Jews ended up scattering all over the world. Most of them went to the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Emperor was like, this is great. I get, the best talent in the world. I'll take them.
So Morocco, they went before, or they?
Yeah, throughout. There were throughout, because in Spain, Jews were persecuted since the 300s. Right. So there was a lot of back and forth. And the interesting thing is that the Spanish Jews who went to what they called Mustarabim communities, basically Arab Jews, they influenced those communities very much. Basically, they became the dominant culture, meaning a Jew from Spain who went to Tunisia, to Libya, etc. They established their culture as the main culture. In Ashkenazi places, it wasn't as much, but their contributions are endless, countless. There's even in Lithuania, where I come from, there's a very famous family, the Ibn Yahya family. How do you become Ibn Yahya in Lithuania? They came all over. The name, I don't know if anyone heard the name Sprinza. It's like a heavy Ashkenazi name. It comes from Esperanza. So all these are, it's hard to even begin to say how much the Spanish Jewish community impacted who we are, but we're going to stop here, take any questions or comments. Yeah? Yeah?
The Jews were expelled in 1492.
Yeah.
Weren't the Moors expelled then too?
I'm sorry?
Didn't they expel the Moors in 1492?
You mean the Muslims?
Yeah.
The Muslims were being pushed out throughout, but it wasn't nearly as brutal. They weren't, tortured the same way. They weren't. It wasn't same. And I'm assuming they didn't also resist the way the Jews did resist conversion.
Now, the Jews originally came from the Roman Empire. They somehow wandered.
Yeah, it was part of the Roman Empire in 281, I think.
And they also went to Portugal at that time?
It's interesting. There were not as many Jews in Portugal. And when the Jews when Portugal decided on an expulsion in 1497, they were in a difficult financial situation. And they realized that if the Jews leave, they will seek financial collapse. So they did the cruel thing. And they said, all Jews must convert, no leaving option. In that sense, the Jews of Spain were even somewhat lucky, where they had at least the option to leave, as opposed to Portugal, where it was, sorry, folks, you're not.
When I went to Portugal, I don't know if they were just trying to cater. They said about 25% of the population can trace.
Yeah, absolutely, because at the time, I believe they were 10% of the population. So for sure, yes.
Right, one was just remark about Portugal. There's a famous movie on Amazon Prime about a general who was not Jewish, and it was his job. He got so involved in discovering where the Converso.
Yeah.
He was responsible for fundraising and building back the synagogue in Portugal, and he himself became Orthodox Jew.
Yeah, I don't know what the name of the movie is on Amazon, where the people, they search for the Converso Jews, but it definitely captures a lot of people's imagination. How, where did the crypto Jews, the Converso Jews end up? And again, there were Converso Jews since the 700s. The Spanish have been forcibly converting Jews since the 700s. So it's likely there are many, many, many millions of people in the world who do have some Converso ancestor. Definitely, if you're Jewish, you are likely in some way a descendant of Converso Jews. Yeah. Oh wow, we have someone here. Okay, yeah.
Asia, I have a daughter in Japan.
All right, you live the Jewish geography dream.
And she was next to Portugal.
Uh-huh.
And she's the only Jewish person there. And sadly, when you walk around the old neighborhood that she used to live in, two streets, the entire synagogue.
Yeah, there's a lot. They didn't uproot the Jewish infrastructure. There are not many Jews. No, that's why they made a law that they would give them the passports.
Girona, they have.
Girona, yeah. Yeah.
As you say, it's like the ghost.
Yes, Spain and Portugal take great pride in the Jews who came from there without acknowledging how they stopped living there. But all right, either way, we're going to stop here. I'd like to thank everyone online and who's here in person, and hello to everyone. And Be'ezrat Hashem, next week we'll be speaking about the Jews of Poland, which again is also a history that has more than 1,000 years. And wishing everyone a very, very happy Hanukkah. Thank you for coming. Thank you.
Chag
All
Sameach.
right, good to see you. Chag Sameach.
Hi, Rabbi Poupko.
Hello,
Hi, good to
hi,
see you.
Chag Sameach. Oh, hello, Roslyn. Hello.
Hi,
Hello, Chag Sameach. Happy Hanukkah.
you too. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Good to see you.